Hey everybody, welcome to the Man Talk podcast. This is episode 38. Today we're going to be talking about control and letting go. So, the impetus for this podcast is basically a discussion that Jacob and I had about past friendships and how we differed on our methods for handling basically distant friendships and whether or not it was worth our time to either rekindle those relationships or friendships or just let them play their course. So, right now I'm going to take the position that it's in most people's interests, not in every single case, but in most people's interests to let go, move on, and find new friends, new experiences that are more equitable to your current circumstances than necessarily hold on to lifelong childhood friends, even if and only if they deviate extremely from where you are currently in your life. um, and then Jacob will take the opposing perspective. So to lay out my case, basically I need to describe a little bit about myself that I haven't talked about much in the podcast. So ever since I was a young guy, I was always more of a floater in friendships, meaning I didn't have one dedicated friend group. In elementary school, middle school, even high school, what I would do instead of hanging out around the same 5 or 10 people, I would walk to various friend groups and hang out with a bunch of different people on the playground or the lunch tables. And I'm not exactly sure why I didn't connect deeply with any of these friends until I would say junior year of high school. But the result of it was that I never had a deep seated connection with people. And I developed more of a perspective like, well, there's a lot of variety in humanity. And although I've known the specific people for like 20 plus years, I don't really have this strong bond with them, the strong connection that I do with people I've known less time, but have connected with more deeply. So maybe that's more of a product of the types of people who were around me at the time when I was growing up in elementary, middle, and then early high school. But in reflection, I think it's also just a product of who I am in the moment, and in the moments that I was growing up, where okay, well, I don't really feel connection with the kids on the schoolyard in elementary school or middle school, but I started to more so in high school and in college and in post college. So it's like, okay, well, from my perspective, then it's a matter of finding the right people and then maintaining that connection and having similar interests that could sustain itself across time. And for me, I never really felt like I had that growing up, at least in my early years, where we had the same goals, had the same life outcomes, and I never really felt the need to, um, I guess, respect the friendship, respect the relationship to the point where even if we're completely different people, we maintain contact and say what's up.
Got it. Okay. So on my neck of the woods, I would say Julian's got some decent points. So far he's already got a few. So one of them is for most people. So this isn't for everybody. Okay, fair enough. Like so we can won't straw man you on that one.
Steel
Mainly
man.
right. Um, and then this it's not going to just be a function of age that forces you to be okay. Well, I should be connected to this person. Cool. Okay, I think we can agree on both those points. Yeah, it's not necessarily for most people, and let's say age is only one function of it, but it's not the whole input. So let's say those are some good starting grounds. Um, I would say, from my background, So I have a particular friend that I've known my whole life. So that's unique to my situation, right? Um, Other people around the world may have a similar case. So maybe most people wouldn't necessarily agree with you on the don't cut your friends that were way the heck back just because of age. But if you get the hybrid mix of long time, lot of experiences together, ups and downs, bonding, development, now that's more inputs than just age. But I would say those other four inputs I mentioned were probably the key factors.
Yeah.
And
In your life, Jacob, you've known people all of your life, like you just mentioned. What qualities about those people lead you to, well, maintain those connections, maintain those ties, rather than, just grow apart and lose connection with them?
man, those are that two qualities I can think of right off the bat are loyalty and honesty. Um, when you've got someone you've known for a long time, those two qualities seem to continue to develop and mature, and you can you can rest on that. I mean, when you're together, of course, and it makes living a lot easier because you've got someone else who's sharing that same level of loyalty and honesty. And I really appreciate having both of those things in a long term friendship because if it's just longevity, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, which you obviously would make the case for that. And I think I would too. Um, but in the case of the loyalty aspect, you gotta know who you belong to. I think that's a good place to start on my neck of the woods. You gotta know who you belong to. If you don't belong to anybody while you're on planet Earth, I think that's kind of a sad existence. You're just kind of gonna float forever. And unfortunately, what makes modern day hard, which we covered in that podcast, I think podcast 17 or 16, where we were talking about the modern day issues. One of the problems is that you're forced to float, whether you like it or not. Before, you could stay in your village and you really could develop those long term bonds that I'm talking about. Now, you could be bumped anywhere because of occupation, because of family, or interest. And all those are just happening a million miles an hour. It can happen at any time. Look at 2020. People are moving all over the place just so they can get new job opportunities or because they have to take care of family or whatever. And it's just that quick. You can drop like a drop of a hat, man. So, for what it's worth, it's been good to maintain that same level of loyalty and honesty over with some of my friends for a long period of time. There's a place of safety. Um, but I bet you would have a counterpoint to that, so I'd like to hear it.
Yeah. So too often in my own life, safety has, for me, has been a means to stagnate, as a means to not mature and grow past my current situation. And although that's very comforting for me, it can get to a point where, well, maybe I should take those opportunities to travel and explore the unknown, as fearful as that may be. But I have all these connections, these roots, and all of this nostalgia for all my friends that I've known the last decade at least. Because I do have long ish term friends, not childhood friends per se, but more like high school friends, which is now a decade ago as of this year. Um, and it would be sad to minimize my in person connection with those people. But with the advent of the internet, like we talked about in the previous podcast, um, there is really minimal reason why you would cut someone off cold turkey unless their worldview is inherently toxic now, and they're just trying to bring people down. Maybe back in the day when it was more difficult to keep in contact with people, you only had their phone number and maybe a handful of minutes loaded up to your phone. Um, it would be a lot easier just to let let those relationships and friendships fade away. But today, uh, short of not liking that person anymore, for who they've become over the years, there, technologically speaking, there is really no excuse for why he can't maintain contact with someone, you know? So it gets into a scenario where, uh, from my perspective, the long-term friends are also going to be your friends who probably have um, different outcomes than where you're progressing towards, unless that friend in particular or those groups of friends um, have a very similar life trajectory as you. So in my case, for my high school friends, a good amount went to college, and they have that college path and post college jobs and are financially successful. So for me, connecting with them and maintaining that bond is pretty straightforward, pretty easy. But for the ones who didn't, I find it very hard to connect to them and maintain the connection with our friendship because we, for example, only talked about video games. These days, I don't play as much video games. Uh, so it's like our interests are different. Our connection has waned. Um, to try to force the situation, from my perspective, because of nostalgia or because I don't want to lose my friends that I've known for X amount of years. Um, well, it just feels pretty arbitrary.
Okay. I will say, you bring up a good point about the no excuse of getting contact because now you've got all the types of technology to stay in contact. I would say, but you still have a limited amount of time.
Yeah,
So maybe we can agree that other friendships will be deprioritized as their missions, their mindset, and your connection decreases. And then that can vary depending on what year it is. And you can rank how it needs to happen. And mainly priorities for them too. I mean, it could be two way. I think two way is a good idea. That way, it's just not you deprioritizing a bunch of people just because you said so. Maybe you can come to a common ground there. Um, I actually don't mind the deprioritizing thing, mainly because we all have lives to live, and for what it's worth, those are things that we need to keep in mind for next time.
yeah. In terms of deprioritizing too, it's always a perspective of mine, or it's always been a perspective of mine, that if the other person also wants to connect with you, they'll send you a message and say, "Hey, what's up?" In my last decade, I think one person on Facebook, maybe a couple more, have reached out and maintained a regular connection without me initially facilitating it. Um, I guess my perspective on that basically is if the other person is interested in maintaining that connection, they will also reach out. In reality, though, I've done a lot of the reaching out and rekindling of friendships that I felt were still valuable enough to connect with. But I always have this inkling in the back of my mind that I'm annoying them or that they moved on and they don't want to continue a friendship. And that one can be tough, letting go of those connections that were once pretty fruitful, but the other person isn't interested anymore. Do you have friends like that, Jacob?
Unfortunately, I
Or
mean,
had?
yeah, I'd say unfortunately that's the case for a lot of people. I think you'd be surprised how many people valued one person more than another, and they messaged and reached out, and they all got rejections of just no response. Really, I think more people would find that that's actually happening more often than not. One person valued the friendship more than the other. So that actually is a theme here to don't be that guy. And if you do need to deprioritize it, say something so that way they don't feel like you're just annoying them, as you said, or giving them those false or misguided thoughts in someone else's head just because you didn't reply back. Um, and it's hard because, I mean, the way social media, not even just social media, but the way phones work and the way comms work versus 20 years ago, you can have 1,000 contacts. So that's tough, man. I mean, we're really only wired for about 150, and to keep track of who's where and what they're doing. You start doing above that, and it gets thin. It gets real thin to know what's going on. It's hard to really know a person, and I bet there's people who say, "Well, I can know 500 people really well," and I'm like, "Well, fair enough, but good luck trying to track all 500 of them monthly, because that's tough. That's really tough." So as far as for me, yeah, if you really got to cut them loose, I'd say there's some criteria that needs to be thought of first. So one is okay, they're showing lack of interest. Fine. Two, maybe you find the root cause of the lack of interest and you find out that no, their life direction is totally different. There's no place for it. For example, someone's over in Massachusetts and you're over in California. They have a completely different life and they're not coming back, and their life's going completely in Massachusetts for the rest of their life. Okay, fair enough. They have no time for it because maybe they're starting a family. Okay, now that's good enough. Let them take the time that they have and put it towards the people that are going to be really close to them. That makes sense. But I'd say the other criteria are, to what loyalty are you bound to people that were very fruitful for, let's say, 10 years? A 10-year friendship, I mean, that's definitely a valuable thing. Do you just want to turn that off just day one? I'd say it give it the time it deserves before you just hit the off button. So that would be a let the trial go, and then see where the verdict goes, and then if it really is okay, we've got all the evidence we need to cut it, then do it. But don't just cut it day one because they're totally in a different frame of mind or they're in a different life than they were when you had them as a friend locally. So that would be some criteria to try and help with this compromise we're trying to reach.
Yeah, and also in terms of that self-reflection, self-consideration, when you're considering, oh, should I keep in contact with this person? It's very important to understand your own motivation for why you're in contact. It could just be as simple as they're a lifelong friend, and blood is thicker than water situation where you're not going to turn your back on them no matter what. Or it could be more gray area where, well, I see this friend through nostalgia glasses, and I'm trying to relive my glory days of my youth, uh, for whatever reason. More likely than not, because I'm a little depressed about what's happening in the moment, so I look in the past to find comfort. If that's the case, which maybe for some friendships, like, oh yeah, I remember we hung out this one summer and we had this blast, and whatever happened to that one guy? And then you look them up and you realize they're in a completely different spot than what you'd expect. Um, those nostalgia glasses start to get a little blurry in the present because it's not the same. Uh, the way people were in a decade, 2 decades ago, can't possibly be the same of what your memory is of it today. Meaning, who they are today is probably going to be very different. And are you okay with that? Do you still want to reach out because you want to connect with who that person is today? Or do you want to reach out because you have ideas of a better past, nostalgia glasses, and you're connecting because you can't, for lack of a better term, you can't move on from how happy you were in the past. Um, so, at least from my perspective, it feels like it can become a dangerous situation where you might regress. You might look to the past to see comfort when you should be trying to work through whatever's going on in the present, uh, so that you can have a better future.
And fair enough. I mean, let's add that to the criteria. Make sure you don't have just nostalgia for what it was, because your present sucks, or it feels like it sucks at the moment. Sure, let's add that to the criteria.
Yeah. And then I guess on that topic, just to close it out a bit, um, at the very least, there's a lot of self-reflection and self-actualization to take place when you're considering what in your past is worth keeping on to the future and what is kind of better left to forget. Maybe not necessarily friendships per se, but also like material items, things you own, or like mementos and all that. And having too much of your past always with you, psychologically speaking, it can become this giant burden, really, because then you might turn into more of a hoarder mindset, which I've seen, at least in my own family, where we can't let go of anything. We have a lot of stuff everywhere, and it's all these memory uh, reminders. Oh yeah, remember this shirt I got at Goodwill a decade ago? Of course I do. I love this shirt. I've worn it once. I don't. So it sounds extreme, but there are like emotional attachment to people and things, of course. And why just throw that away, literally or figuratively, when you can just make room for it, compartmentalize it, and carry it with you throughout your whole life, you know?
So with items, yeah, what you're describing is I will risk the burden of having more stuff than I could possibly manage for the sake of having emotional attachment whenever I'd like, just by looking at my house. Now,
Correct.
the problem is you can't really go forward with that because you're stuck looking at your stuff. That's where your attention and time go. So that's the trade off. So you've decided inadvertently that by putting up that much of the past and benching it, that is all you're going to do. Okay, fair enough, but I mean that's the trade. So if you have something to do in the future, that's where Julian and I think would be making the case that actually you should only have enough stuff such that it is has utility and you're able to move forward in the world without feeling cluttered, which is a big problem in the suburbia factor. You know, boxes upon boxes in the garage and these random rooms that just have a full of boxes and stuff they're not even sometimes stuff they're not even looking at, so they don't even get emotional about it because all they're seeing is the box, and that's not emotional. That's just more stuff. So in our case, we're definitely going to make the utilitarian approach and say keep the stuff that's useful and maybe have a way to store your mementos in a way that doesn't burden you for tomorrow.
And I recommend photos. So now that we're in the 21st century, it's very unlikely that all digital items are going to perish short of a giant solar flare or gamma ray burst that destroys all electronics on the planet. But if we're getting there, then it doesn't really matter what happens. But if you take photos of your most important things, at least you'll have a visual memory, if not a physical memory, of the item. And there's no way any one person can fill up terabytes and terabytes of storage of photos online. It's virtually unlimited if you desire to declutter physically. So taking photos of those items just so you can look back on it and remember can save you from taking up valuable real estate in your physical house. So that's one way of coping.
I'd say another one is as far as the stuff you save the highest priority. And as far as vacations or trips or whatever, wherever I went, I'm not taking photos of every stinking day. I think that's too much. That's too much to carry, even digitally, because I don't want to look at it all. So what ends up happening is, cool, you took all those photos, so you spent that much time taking them, and then they're just going to sit there. So what that means is someone else is probably going to, if you share with them, the best case scenario is someone else can enjoy the photo for you, but you don't get to enjoy the photo. So that's not a good deal. So it's how much do you want to relive in the past what you're living in the present? It's a question of priority in terms of enjoyment. Do you can enjoy it now, later, never, storage? The choice is yours, but definitely know that there is a choice you're making with your actions. Um, that's definitely a choice that you make with your actions. Don't think that, oh, I'll just save this for later. It's like, no, you may have already made your choice in the moment.
Right. So it's like that's a good counterpoint to a degree because it's like, well, you go on vacation and you take 3,000 photos. Did you have a vacation or did you just take a bunch of photos? So,
It's something worth thinking about. I've had people do this, and I'm going, great. You made this giant album that you'll look at for the rest of your life. Well, maybe, or you may look at five of your best photos, and then the rest just sits there on that album, whether digital or physical. It can still be a clutter because, as we're finding out, you only have so much screen space, man. So if you've got
yeah,
to page down through all those photos, guess what? You still have a time waster. So
right.
it's something to consider.
Yeah. I mean, from a psychology perspective, it generally speaking gets me kind of sad thinking or spending too much time in the past and kind of just existing or sitting there. So it's not so much that I'm blocking out the past, it's more like I acknowledge its existence and I draw nuggets of wisdom where I can from those moments that can essentially ensure that my future can be more prosperous. Because those moments of self reflection should be moments, they shouldn't be your life, right? When they become your life, that's more of like depression, I would say. Like you're again harkening back to better days in your mind. So you're self selecting the highlight reel of your life. But in doing so, there's a chance of getting diluted, or a very large chance, because you could be looking at only the positive sides. Maybe you're even looking at just the negative sides too. You just have to be aware of how you can be your own worst enemy in those regards, you know? Um, and really consider where your self esteem is at in terms of why am I having all these thoughts about the past right now? Why am I being so reflective right now? What's going on in my present that would push me to focus on those things in my past? Um, I know because of the COVID-19 thing, so many people are probably in self reflection mode and trying to cope with being housed up in their home for months at a time, right? So now would be like the perfect time to do two things, really. Self reflect on what's happened in the past and just kind of get into that spiral, not kind of stagnating in place, or fixing up your home, planning for the future when the whole thing uh, settles down and you can actually go outside again. And I think uh, I would say the vast majority of people are doing both to their own degrees, where they're using it as a means of self reflection, the shutdown, but also doing what they can now so that they're better prepped once it's all over.
Yeah, I'd make the case that a healthy dose of self reflection is exactly what you would need per day. In fact, that's probably what's going on in your sleep cycles is it's just going super in reverse as your brain's recalibrating and getting maintenance during your sleep cycle. But I'd say actively when you're awake, there is a healthy point of self reflection I think people don't do enough of. I would actually argue that point. Before COVID, I think people were just zipping all over the place, and they just didn't even care.
Right.
And I actually had that problem show up to me when I was first starting to work. And then when I got out and I got into my next job, I noticed how much more I sat down again and just kind of played back what the heck was going on. I wanted life to slow down a little bit. And maybe this is what everyone needs is just this giant maintenance period. But for what it's worth, yeah, if you only self-reflect, which I think is the bigger argument here, that's where you get into trouble because you can never look what's coming ahead and you can't actually live. You're just living where you once were, but you're not really living there. You're just spending time there. It's like a
Constant visiting of the past.
yeah, it's like a mental vacation or something.
Right. More or less. What's the term? Um, Not dejected, but more. I guess mental vacation is the best way to encapsulate it.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I also wanted to touch on was being so possessed by the past that you have to control everything around you to maintain the idea of what happened. So this can manifest itself in pretty nefarious ways where you would incorporate like gaslighting, manipulation, just tactics that essentially when other people look at you, they're like, why are you acting so strange? Your version of the past isn't everyone's version. Like this happened to me a few months ago, really. Someone had a few friends in high school, and they were telling me their version of events, and it was completely different from my version of events because I was missing a key insight that they never told me until a decade later. That completely changed my whole perspective on it. It was mostly like I didn't realize that the two of them were communicating amongst each other while the three of us were all hanging out. I thought it was each person was their own island scenario, right? So I had my thoughts, and the other two had their own thoughts, and there wasn't intercommunication. But what was actually going on was they were talking amongst themselves, asking themselves, "Oh, why is Julian acting this way?" Um, and my realization of that was like, "Oh, that kind of changes my whole perspective on this situation because had I known that they were in contact with each other, then I wouldn't have told at the time I wouldn't have told them different, bits of information
Ooh.
because yeah. So what I would used to do to see if people were sharing information amongst each other uh, is share different versions of events with different people to see if they would cross contaminate, and then I could tell who's telling what. Because the whole idea is I want to tell people secretive things, right? So it's a matter, from my perspective, it was a matter of trust. So I would tell them a specific variation of the event that's about 98, 95% accurate with 5% embellishment. And with these two specific people, that 5% was relatively important to know whether or not the information got the cat got out of the bag kind of thing. So when I realized a decade later, like, oh, they were just telling each other everything, so they could parse out what I was telling was the full truth or just parts of the truth, then it made me realize, like, oh, I didn't consider that at the time because me being the controlling person, wanting to control the narrative, so to speak, um, would outsmart, two other people. But I didn't realize that no, that's not what happened. You told two people slightly different variations, and then they just proceeded to tell each other the same, slightly slight variations. And then when they confronted you, they knew the full story, and you only knew what you told each of them, right? So I guess what I learned from that experience was controlling the outcome was a really bad idea, but I didn't uh, The reason it was bad was because I was of the assumption that they wouldn't communicate with each other, and um, I felt like I could control the outcome of whatever the situation was at the time, which isn't what happened. It was more like they controlled the outcome, which is kind of ironic if you think about it, right? So if I came at it more from the perspective that I do now, like, oh, just tell people the same thing, and if you don't want to have a different outcome, don't share a different outcome that could occur, right? Don't even give the idea to people. Just trust your friends, essentially. Trust that they're not trying to backstab you. Trust that they're not trying to manipulate you like you're trying to manipulate them.
And I would
So,
recommend from the Jordan Peterson's list of tools, I suppose, he would say that is the greatest resource, trust. You can't do anything without it because then you're just going to want to control everything. Well, guess what? One person can't run the world. It takes a whole world of people to run the world. So,
yeah. So that's what I learned once I got older, that I wasn't the mastermind that I thought I was, where I can just control the outcomes of all events. It's more like I need to come at it more from the perspective that I can offer up what I can offer up, and then if the other person is interested in that, they can come along for the ride. Not that, oh, I'm gonna force this person's hand and make them act in a way that's against the way that they would normally act. It wasn't obvious when I was younger, because at least back when I was younger, I was less aware of how people actually function, because I had my own encapsulation of how that stuff works, how interpersonal communication works. But nowadays, it's a lot more clear. Like, oh yeah, um, people don't like this. They catch on to it. They're not stupid as much as you would like them to think. As much as you would like to think they're stupid, they're as smart or smarter than you when it comes to certain things. And the arrogance to think otherwise is more of a personality trait downfall of your own doing than anything to do with you not getting your way.
yeah, pretty much stay away from the manipulations aspects. So, the Reddit persona types, the bullies, the minor manipulators of the truth that you may have once been, all those kind of people. I mean, people can kind of read other than just your story. I mean, I think that's the main root cause here, right? Okay, how did this fail? Main thing is you can't control their avenues of other information or thinking throughputs that may overcome the misinformation or may ignore the misinformation that was lacking, and then they just actually get the good story because they go, well, this is probably what he inferred to if we took out this part. People are rather creative. I mean, that's probably one of the main reasons why we still have been able to function as a society, even though the news is completely toxic. Um, but
Yeah, people can sniff out liars or manipulators, especially as when they're older. Like they can. So I was thinking when I was younger, like, oh, how did my parents know that I was lying when I told them something? And then now that I'm getting older, I just realized, oh, they just had more experience, and a little kid's not going to one up them, you know. Even though the little kid's gonna probably have the idea that they're, smarter than them. Sometimes the parents can just let you get away with it, so to speak, when you're not actually getting away with it. They're well aware of what you're doing. So it as I aged, I got a more broader perspective on, oh, okay, well, I'm not the center of the world. The world doesn't bow down to me. I'm one of many in the world, and I would prefer to interact with the world in a more positive light than try to continue this Machiavelli game where everyone else suffers at my hand. Because when you're young and disenfranchised from power or control or whatever, that's a very tempting idea, right? to go down that path where you're stepping over other people to rise to the top. But that's not a long-term strategy, because those people are going to remember, like, oh yeah, remember when that kid did that to you? That's not good.
It's that simple. You'd have people that they take notes on what you're doing, and you can take away the paper, you can take away the pencil, you can't take away their brain. Uh, you can take away their phone, still can't take away the brain. They're still going to find a way around it. We're wired to figure out what's going on. Social animals, man. You, whether it's a evolutionist thing or creation thing is a totally different subject, but for what it's worth, that's going to stay the same. So let go of your power hungry schemes, I guess is the theme here. Even though it's
That's one
tempting when you don't
that's
have
one of
it.
the themes, yeah. But in terms of, okay, how do you transition from someone who's more of a schemer, more of a manipulator at heart, to someone who's more, not necessarily empathetic, but more inclined to help out those around them genuinely, and more inclined to want to do that rather than feel like they're forced to do that because that's what you're supposed to do. Um, and that's where the past can become very helpful, because from the past you can draw on experiences, traumatic or otherwise positive, where you can see, okay, my actions in that moment that lead to good outcome or bad outcome. And if you have a pedigree of bad outcomes, it's a little insane to think that continuing that mindset that got you into those bad outcomes will lead to a more positive outcome. That's where the self-awareness kicks in again, because it's like, okay, well, I genuinely had good outcomes when I did these good things, and I was honest, direct, forthcoming, cared, connected with friends who also had my back, also had my best interest in mind because we had a mutual understanding, versus, oh, I burnt my bridge with this one friend group because I was selfish and thought of only myself rather than my friends or friends. So the past can be useful to remind yourself of, oh, okay, well, you screwed up in the past. Um, there is no nostalgia classes here because it's just an acknowledgement that you were this way. How can you become a better person for today and the future?
Great questions to figure out, especially if you're coming from that background. And a lot of it is if, let's say, we had people that backstabbed us or something and we got rid of them from our friend groups. Some, you'd be surprised. Some people are more likely to accept them back in if they understand what they did was incorrect and they show actionable proof that they're not going to do that anymore. People kind of like that redemptive story. I mean, that kind of goes back to the Jesus thing. You know, absolute redemption for people who didn't deserve it. And the same concepts going here, I think, with people. We kind of like that if they actually did change for the better. Now, if they just screw you over again, oh dear, like be careful. That's somebody you gotta keep an eye on, and then they get deprioritized again. But typically, if people understand why they messed up, you'd be surprised what kind of forgiveness to come your way. So that'd be another theme for letting go of the hatred if you're on the side of the people who've been wronged by a particular individual. See if you can let that go and see if a bridge can be reformed again. Now, it can't always, but reconciliation's not necessarily a bad thing if they've learned their lesson.
Yeah. And one more thing I'd add to that, in terms of looking to the past for help in the present or future, is to, we mentioned it a little bit earlier in the podcast, but it's very important not to have analysis paralysis,
Oh yeah,
which, as the name suggests, being stuck in one mode of thought, one train of thought, and not pressing forward, growing past the experience. So I have a few friends who are stagnated, I would say, and they're stuck in the analysis paralysis phase of their life where they don't really know where they're going to go. And that's kind of tricky in your late 20s because by your late 20s, more or less, at least in the American society, you're supposed to kind of settle down and settle into the rest of your life, at least by your 30s. And if you're too busy trying to figure out exactly the correct way to navigating the future, um, it might be indicative of a need to control the outcome of what's going to happen in the future. And that shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be you set yourself up in such a way that regardless of the outcome, you get what you want, if that makes sense. Meaning that you work your way towards a specific lifestyle, I would say, where married, unmarried, homeowner, renter, you more or less living the life that you want to live. And the peripheral details like, oh, this is how big my house is, this is how many cars I have, this is how many wives I managed to marry, don't matter as much. Um, because as long as you get that outcome that you're seeking towards, maybe just typical suburban lifestyle, if you somehow manage to obtain that, then the details of it don't necessarily matter immediately. They can matter if all you have is the exoskeleton of the idea manifests itself. Oh, I bought a house, but there's no furniture. So now I need to buy furniture, but there's no family. So it's negotiating with with the present to figure out how you can obtain your future that works for you, rather than forcing an outcome of the future that has to happen at all costs.
Yeah, let go of your absolutely crazy ideas that you need to force on now because you think it'll make you feel better currently, and that's where you need to be in terms of status, something like that.
Yeah, forcing a status outcome
Yeah,
rather than whether or not the outcome makes you happy or makes your life more enjoyable.
yeah, that's a good assessment. And a lot of people get stuck in this trap because there is this cultural expectation to, in your 30s, you need to have this stuff. This minimum requirements now changes as you get older. And it puts a lot of people in a tight spot culturally, for what it's worth, because they think they have to meet these things in order to be accepted. And to a certain extent, they may actually get a little bit of cultural feedback for not doing that. So it's not that they're wrong, it's just that they need to be brave enough to not just get it because the culture said so, at least in the time frame that the culture dictates.
A good way to buttress yourself against cultural um, expectations
Yeah.
is to write in your own words what you want. And a great tool for this is the self authoring suite by Jordan Peterson, because you're essentially elaborating your thoughts that and inclinations that you may have. Sure, they might be contaminated by cultural expectations, but at the very least, it is your own words explaining what you want and what outcome you desire to have. And although the culture might dope itself into your outcomes, what you see yourself in the future becoming, you're you're acknowledging and adopting that position. So in a sense, it becomes your own belief system because it's your words. You typed it out. Now, maybe it could be in a scenario where you're just writing out other people's outcomes, but the idea is when you start the journaling, self-authoring process, you'll come back to it. You'll revise it. You'll realize, oh, I don't actually want that. That's what I wanted 2 years ago.
And you wouldn't
I
know
did.
that unless you actually tried to write it down and see for yourself whether it's contaminated or not. You need to be able to discern, but how would you do it unless you didn't look, you didn't write it? So we'd actually recommend to do that. And it's in some form of looking at the expectations, looking at your desires, looking at what would be best for both. Maybe there's a reconciliation that can happen between the two. And from then iterating to see if we can get some kind of solution here, because maybe there's a way to make everybody happy, maybe there isn't, but you won't find out if you don't write it down and see for yourself what's really going on in that head of yours.
Yeah, and as Peterson says, do it badly first.
Great advice. I did it badly and I still haven't redone it yet, actually.
Yeah, and at least from my perspective, it's helped a lot to, well, put my desires down in the words, or at least have a record that I can look back and see if I progress to the point where I want to progress to. Because if I have no expectations for myself, like at all, which is hard to believe for any person, right? You don't desire to become anything, just live in pure nihilistic, heathenistic self-indulgence. No, you probably have some desires that require effort, require self-thought, self-reflection, but you're not going to get there through lacking self-awareness, not really sitting down with yourself and not focusing so much on the past, but trying to guide yourself towards a better understanding of where you want to go in the future.
Yeah, I'm glad we got to talk about some of this because I think a lot of people could benefit from looking at what's really going on, especially right now if they've got any healthy form of self-reflection they'd like to do. This would be some of the good points to be able to look over. And I'm really glad you brought up about the friendship thing, as far as some of these friends that I honestly would not want to let go. And I'm glad this has reinforced some of that. Okay, yeah, you don't have to, but consider the criteria for what it would take before it becomes unhealthy. So I'll keep
Yes,
that in mind for myself. And for what it's worth, I'm glad that the criteria is out there. Because before, I don't think I had a list for actually giving a verdict for why people should leave my life. But now I do.
that's good to hear. Yeah. And then from my perspective, it's clear that it's not my place to just cut people out because they've done one thing wrong, which isn't really my position to begin with. But there is a justification for losing contact with people, and it's not just willy nilly, impulsively do away with the past because you're frustrated in the present.
Good, good. I think we both learned some patience on that one, which was the
Yeah,
third characteristic I couldn't remember. Um, Loyalty, honesty, patience.
good. A good metric for a sustainable, healthy friendship and relationship.
Yeah.
Okay, okay. I think that's all we have for today, everyone. Thanks for listening or watching, and we'll see you in the next podcast or listen.
Cool. See you next time, everybody.